While discussing Robert Bresson, Andrei Tarkovsky once said, "It seems to me that he is the only director in the world that has achieved absolute simplicity in cinema, as it was achieved in music by Bach, art by Leonardo. Tolstoy achieved it as a writer. More still, fellow Frenchman Jean-Luc Godard compared Bresson to Dostoevsky and Mozart. Yet despite the respect of his peers and the plethora of timeless classics he produced during his career, such as O Hasard Balthazar, Diary of a Country Priest, and A Man Escaped, I fear Bresson has fallen somewhat into the background of today's cinema landscape. If I were to ask, who is the first to come to mind when thinking of French cinema? Likely you would mention the likes of the aforementioned Godard, or Truffaut, perhaps Varda. And it makes sense. It's undeniable that these cutting-edge progressives of the new wave are far more inviting than Bresson's opaque, Catholically inspired formalism. Bresson certainly does not make it easy to see his brilliance. But despite his unorthodox methods, there are some who would place Bresson beside some of the greatest artists in recorded history. Why? Why do we still care about Bresson after all this time? Or why should we? The answer to that question goes back to the words of Tarkovsky: absolute simplicity. The methodology Paul Schrader would later label as the Transcendental style. It was through this stringent dedication to minimalism that Bresson became one of the first to transmute the poetic image to film, and even laid the groundwork for others to do the same. Yes, a literal schematic which allows any aspiring auteur to puncture the spiritual plane through cinematography. But of course, the instructions to do so are not so easily followed. Throughout this video, I will first give an overview of the components to Bresson's transcendental style. We will then discuss the philosophy behind his artistic choices and how these choices affect the viewer's experience. After this, we will fast forward and examine how Bresson's influence manifests itself in the modern day, and why these techniques are still desirable and sometimes necessary to employ in this new generation of cinema. Over a 40-plus year career, Bresson developed one of the most recognizable artistic voices in cinema history. In fact, he was one of the key figures cited during the genesis of auteur theory by people like Truffaut and Bazin. And one of the most glaring of Bresson's stylistic tendencies that a first-time viewer is likely to notice was his unique approach to acting, or the lack thereof. You see, Bresson only worked with untrained performers, who to him, unlike professional actors, were yet capable of displaying unfiltered emotion. Now, picking people off the street is certainly not an original idea, as the early days of Italian neorealism might suggest. However, Bresson takes this search for naturality to the extreme by refusing the very idea of acting altogether. In his book, Notes on the Cinematograph, he refers to his actors as models, with these models behaving more so as vessels for the director's words rather than the physical embodiment of a character. Or to once again quote Tarkovsky, "They do not play personae, but live their own inner lives in front of our eyes." Bresson wanted to remove any instinctual expressiveness from the performance. The reasoning behind this decision being that the actor learning his part presupposes a self, known in advance, which does not exist. You see, Bresson was obsessed with the truth above everything. Therefore, acting in his eyes was a lie, and thus impermissible in a film. This results in deadpan expressions, lines delivered cold and monotone, and body language that is janky and awkward. Yet this is what he preferred. The thing that matters is not what they show me, but what they can hide from me. And above all, what they do not suspect is in them. Any actor can fabricate emotions, but Bresson was interested in the emotions that can't be faked, the ineffable that can only be expressed through authenticity. And this performative restraint extends to every facet of Bresson's work. Dialogue is sparse and to the point. Stories are small-scale, simplistic, and grounded, and never changes lens. And the score, if he chose to employ it, was only ever a brief bout of classical music, usually at the beginning and end of a film. And once again, this hyper-dedication to minimalism was all in service of seeking poetic truth. Rather than relying on conjuring emotion through these cinematic tricks, Bresson only gives what can naturally be derived from the image as it was conceived, creating a form of direct communication between audience and auteur. Now, besides this rather subjectively defined search for truth, there is another minor motive that drove Bresson's philosophy, that being to further separate the relatively young art of cinema from the theater, and thus reliance on resources of the theater, as he calls them, acting, of course, being one of them. He argues that by utilizing theatrics in cinema, the filmmaker is effectively reproducing a stage show. The example he gives for this concept is quite revealing. He writes, "A photographic reproduction of Donatello's St. John the Baptist or of Vermeer's Young Woman with Necklace has not the power, the value, or the price of that sculpture or that painting. It does not create anything." Harsh words indeed. Now, this need to somehow evolve past the stage may seem like a bit of a strange or downright unnecessary objective. But consider where film came from. In the beginning, during the silent era, it was all but inevitable that cinema would take after its closest relative, the theater. Not only did the lack of sound require a far more expressive range of acting, but what else were these actors supposed to go off of? Before cinema, there was no other medium outside of the performing arts that could capture a story so kinetically. Thus, when the moving picture was invented, the transition between the two was only natural. Yet I understand Bresson's viewpoint completely. Following the advent of talkies and the ever-growing cultural takeover of film, it should have been abundantly clear that film had grown out of its theatrical training wheels, so to speak. But to distinguish the two is not as easy as flicking a mental switch. We're talking about expressing the human experience in a way that had never been done before, creating something that doesn't exist. As a start, however, one might focus on doing what the stage cannot. And that is exactly what Bresson did by honing in on the versatility of the film image, the ability to direct the eye towards the minutiae that might otherwise fall into the backdrop from the nosebleeds of a theater. Bresson understood this superpower of the cinema perfectly and used it as a means to evoke visual poetry. Consistently through his work, we see the mundane exalted, reaching towards the divine. A glass of brandy, a donkey's hollow gaze, or a hand reaching into a victim's pocket. These moments are exactly what makes acting obsolete, because the onus is taken off of the actor, whose shoulders are usually burdened by the entirety of a stage performance, by balancing the importance of humanity with the spiritual. In film, it is image, rather than affectation, that makes up the language of the cinematographer. As we take a step away here from theory and more into application, I feel like I should mention that the point here is not that every art film should look and feel like a Bresson film. There are plenty of viable modes of expression which Bresson probably wouldn't have liked. For example, the Japanese have been incorporating elements of their kabuki theater style with film since the very beginning to gorgeous effect, denying Bresson's strict rule never to combine the two. There's also David Lynch, who I believe has taken surrealism, a movement quite literally in direct opposition to the physical truth, to its aesthetic maximum with Inland Empire. But rather, it is Bresson's overarching principles which must be studied if one is to follow purely artistic motives in filmmaking. Willfully ignoring inner truth without restraint nor intent, this is what I find unacceptable. I'd go as far to say that the films which do so are cut from the very same cloth as pornography, by giving the viewer exactly what they want in abundance. Perhaps it is conscious or perhaps not, but a director absolutely cannot achieve perfect truth when their film is preoccupied with satisfying the carnal hunger of its audience. To illustrate, let us examine Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream. Yes, it is disturbing to watch. However, much of the emotion here has been artificially created through things like the editing, the overly intense soundtrack, the intensity of the actors expressing the violence inflicted upon them. The situation is sad on its own. A man loses his arm to heroin usage while his girlfriend resorts to sex work, his friend rots in prison, and his mother is rendered catatonic by electrotherapy. Thus, the affectation Aronofsky applies here is extraneous. It is sacrificing artistic integrity to make itself more consumable. This to me is the very definition of emotional pornography. In an interview with Paul Schrader, Bresson actually discusses the topic of pornography, where he had this to say: "Pornography has brought that to the cinema, that you must see everything. So the public is now conditioned to films where you show everything. It is terrible. It is human nature to crave everything, as Bresson puts it. The sex, the violence, especially when it is in the easily digestible form of entertainment. And this is usually fine, as we'll talk more on later, but one cannot hope to reach for the transcendent if audience expectations are made such a priority." But how did Bresson handle violence in his films? Well, by now it should come as no surprise that he handled it much like anything else, with restraint. As he tells Schrader, "You can be moved by death if you don't show it, if you suggest it. But if you show it, it's finished." The same thing about love. You don't feel love if you see two people making love. One scene that epitomizes Bressonian violence, as I'll call it, appears in his final film, L'Argent. The last scene specifically in which Yvon murders an entire family with an axe. The problem in depicting this violent act was never a question of practicality. In 1983, with films such as Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween having been made long before, Bresson could have easily made the scene look relatively realistic if he so desired. The problem rather is that it would be dishonest. No matter how realistically an act is simulated, we will always know subconsciously that it is false. Contrary to his words, however, Bresson has shown violence before, although in extremely rare circumstances. The only moments that really come to mind where the violence is overt are this scene from Lancelot du Lac and this one from Four Nights of a Dreamer, but there could very well be more. And though these scenes are few and far between, they show that violence can exist within the transcendental style, but they must be treated with the same delicacy as the rest of the film, and takes a tremendous amount of skill to properly pull off. This is because if the profundity of violence is drowned out by theatrics, it will ultimately fail to hold its power. But when it is presented naked, only then can it transcend exploitation to serve a higher artistic purpose, and affect the viewer on a deeper level. I'd like to shift now to the future, after Bresson completed all he set out to do, and having laid the foundation that filmmakers have been studying and expanding upon ever since. One modern director specifically, who I believe has taken the Bressonian principles to new heights, is Michael Haneke. Critics and audiences alike describe Haneke's films as intensely disturbing and deeply uncomfortable, and this is due to his refusal to allow the viewer to take pleasure in violence, applying Bresson's anti-entertainment methods in ways Bresson never dared to try. There's perhaps no scene which encapsulates the 21st century Bressonianism better than the ending of 2001's The Piano Teacher. This scene checks all the boxes. There is no soundtrack. In fact, it is totally silent. What's more, we are refused the benefit of a narrative resolution, with the screen simply cutting to black. I would even say this qualifies as anti-acting from Isabella Huppert, at least a modern version of it. Her face contorts slightly in pain, however, Haneke omits the auditory stimulus one would normally expect. The lack of these cinematic guideposts steering the mind is what's creating the incredibly upsetting atmosphere we are meant to be feeling. Haneke himself once said that the ideal scene should force the spectator to look away because they cannot stand it, and stating that if you reach this, your film will be more than just consumed. In other words, he is forcing the audience to treat the subject seriously by delving past their coping mechanisms. It's the reason Haneke can get away with such incessant violence without betraying Bressonian philosophy. In fact, Haneke has been quite outspoken in the past about films which treat sensitive subject matter lightly, and one in particular that may come as a surprise.
Ich finde einen Film wie ein Spielberg-Film über das Konzentrationslager auch falsch. Ich kann nicht einen Spannungsmoment daraus machen, ob aus der Dusche Gas oder Wasser kommt. Ja? Das ist meiner Meinung nach eine falsche Herangehensweise.
Now, of course, I'm not saying that this thought from Haneke in any way came from Bresson directly, but the shower scene he points to here is decidedly anti-Bressonian. By fabricating this subversion of expectations to resolve the tension in the audience, Spielberg here is creating emotions rather than trusting the viewer to internalize the inherent horror of the situation. And this idea of treating war as some malleable plot, trying to improve upon it with storytelling techniques, to me, this is frankly absurd.
Das Konsumieren hat auch seine Funktion. Also ich schaue mir irgendwas an, wenn das gut gemacht ist und amüsant ist, konsumiere ich gern was den ganzen Abend. Aber hängt immer davon ab, welches Sujet ich behandle. Ne? Es gibt halt, wenn man sich problematischeren Dingen zuwendet, dann muss man sie auch in ihrer Problematik versuchen auszuloten.
This right here is the key. The problem of showing violence in film has never been one of content, but one of method. That method being truth above all. Now, Bresson himself never made a World War II film, although you could make an argument that A Man Escaped was, as it is based on Bresson's own experience as a POW. However, the story is so self-contained that it seems wrong to call it historical fiction. But if he did make one, a World War II film that is, I predict it would look a lot more like Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest than Schindler's List, which I can only predict he would have similarly disliked. This 2023 Holocaust film is shown from the perspective of a German officer at Auschwitz. Yet, by a stroke of genius, we are only shown his home life. There's not a single instance of violence or sex shown within the film, and yet we know it is happening just next door. Not just from the historical context, but from the barely audible cacophony of dogs barking, babies crying, and screams of pain subtly pervading the background of every shot. Remember what Bresson says. You can be moved by death if you don't show it, if you suggest it, and this is exactly what the film is doing. Furthermore, it uses music sparingly in a similar fashion to Bresson, and any semblance of plot is totally inconsequential and dull. The zone of interest is completely and purposefully unenjoyable to the viewer, as it should be. It seems completely ridiculous that a film such as Schindler's List, or worse yet, Saving Private Ryan, or any of the like, should be making hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. If that many people want to see a film about war, there's clearly something wrong. No, it is not a crime to create or consume entertainment for the sake of it, but there is a time and a place to do so. And now the question remains, is Bresson still relevant today? Well, unequivocally, of course. But let us reflect on the reasons that we've discussed throughout this video. First, he developed a signature style radically different from anything seen previously and is impossible to emulate. And because of these methods that make up said style, he is one of the key innovators in cinema history. But his impact doesn't end with his retirement, as his influence has been felt throughout every major movement in art house since the 50s, starting with the French New Wave. And the influence is still being felt today, especially in the slow cinema of directors such as Haneke, Bellatar, and Lav Diaz. However, despite all this, if you are to take anything away from this video, let it be this. Of course it is important to commemorate Bresson, his methodology, and his library of films for the sake of preserving cinema history. But what is essential is the need to remember the seriousness that Bresson brought to the screen. A common criticism aimed at directors such as Bresson is that they're pretentious or pompous, and perhaps there is some validity to this claim, although for the record, I am in total disagreement. However, when a film begins to delve into the darker subject matters, it is no longer a matter of simply making a good movie. Rather, it becomes the moral responsibility of the director to treat their subject with the dignity and respect that it deserves. So not only is Bresson relevant, he is necessary. I genuinely believe he is the single greatest reference material for both filmmakers and audiences to learn the craft of cinematography. Because you need only understand one thing. For the filmmaker, tell the truth. And for the viewer, seek truth. Of course, this is not always the easiest advice to follow, yet learning and applying this lesson is truly the key to unlocking the unspeakable beauty that cinema is capable of. This has been the Cinema Revivalist. Thank you for watching.